Clara had long since settled into the rhythm of her life. At 80, she had the kind of routine most people only dreamed of, a quiet existence where time stretched endlessly. A simple life filled with cups of tea, books she had read too many times to count, and the occasional foray into the garden, where flowers bloomed just as predictably as the seasons passed. She lived alone in the same house she had raised her children in, a small, ivy-covered bungalow in a quiet suburb. The house was filled with memories, some joyful, some tinged with sorrow, but all unmistakably hers. Her days had been peaceful, if uneventful. The phone calls from her friends were fewer now, their voices softer with age, as if they too had begun to feel the heaviness of time. Her family, once the center of her world, was distant. Her husband, George, had passed away 5 years ago, and her daughter, Rachel, had long since moved to the other side of the country. Clara had accepted the solitude, finding solace in the memories that filled the rooms around her. Still, there was a quiet ache that sometimes settled in her chest when she thought of her son, Daniel. Daniel had left home when he was just 18, a rebellious streak driving him away from the safe, structured life Clara had worked so hard to build. At first, he had promised to return, to keep in touch, but time had passed, and the promises had grown thinner. Clara had tried to reach him, letters, phone calls, even emails, but they were met with silence. Years went by, and she had come to terms with the fact that Daniel, her only son, had disappeared from her life. And then, one chilly autumn afternoon, as Clara was making her way to the kitchen to prepare her usual cup of tea, the doorbell rang. At first, she assumed it was a neighbor, maybe Miss Henderson from next door, asking if she had any sugar or if she needed help with something. But when she opened the door, it wasn't Miss Henderson standing there. It wasn't anyone she had expected to see. Standing before her was Daniel. He looked different, older, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, his face more lined, his eyes tired. But the same eyes, those deep, searching eyes, were looking back at her. It took a moment for Clara to absorb the sight. She blinked a few times, as if trying to wake from a dream. Was it really him? Could it be? Mom, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll come home. Clara didn't know what to do, what to say. The years of silence had built a wall between them, a wall that Clara had long ago convinced herself she could live with. She had tried to bury her hopes, to let go of the pain of his absence. And now, here he was standing in her doorway, like a ghost come back to life. Daniel, she finally whispered, her voice shaky. After all these years, why now? Daniel hesitated, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting her gaze again. I made a mess of things, Mom. I was a fool. I should have never left. But I want to make things right. I want to try to fix what I broke. Clara's heart raced as she struggled to process what was happening. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times over the years, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming mix of emotions she felt now. Anger, relief, confusion, and the faintest glimmer of hope all collided within her. The woman who had once been a mother to a small boy, a woman who had fought so hard for their family, felt a flood of memories overwhelm her. She stepped aside and motioned for him to come in, her movements automatic. As Daniel crossed the threshold into the house, Clara felt an unexpected warmth in her chest, like a door she thought was long closed had creaked open just a crack. There was a long silence between them as Clara led him into the living room, where they sat down, the space between them seeming too vast, too cold for comfort. "There?" Clara asked, her voice steady but unsure. She moved toward the kitchen, trying to keep her hands from trembling. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to feel, what she was supposed to say. There were years of hurt, years of abandonment, and they both knew it. "Yes, please," Daniel said quietly, his voice low. His eyes were fixed on the floor, as though he were afraid to meet her gaze for too long. It struck Clara then. He seemed smaller, not the defiant young man who had left her all those years ago, but a man who had carried too many burdens alone for too long. As Clara prepared the tea, The sounds of the kettle boiling and cups clinking against the counter felt strangely domestic, as if nothing had ever changed. But everything had changed. Clara could feel it in her bones, the weight of the moment, the presence of the son she had lost and found again. When Clara returned to the living room with the steaming cups, she sat across from Daniel. The silence stretched between them, both of them hesitant to speak. Finally, Clara set her cup down and looked him in the eye. "Why now, Daniel? After all this time?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion she didn't know how to hide. I don't know how to explain it," Daniel said, his hands shaking as he held the tea. "I just woke up one day and realized I couldn't keep living like this. The past is always there, and I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore. I messed up so much, with you, with everything. I need to fix it, if I can." Clara watched him, her heart aching for the boy she had once known, the man who had gone so far away, both physically and emotionally. She had spent so many years wondering what had happened to him, imagining 100 scenarios, each one worse than the last. And now, here he was, a broken man asking for forgiveness. She didn't know if she could give him what he wanted, but the truth was she didn't know what else to do but listen. "You've been gone a long time, Daniel," Clara said softly, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I can just forget everything, but I'm willing to try. I don't know what this will look like or if we can fix it, but I don't want to close the door again." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, Clara saw a flicker of the child he once was, the child she had held in her arms, the child she had loved with every fiber of her being. In that moment, something shifted. The years of silence, the anger, the hurt, all of it began to unravel slowly, like a thread coming undone. "I don't deserve it," Daniel whispered, "but I'm here, and I won't go anywhere this time." Clara nodded, her chest tight with emotion. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the weight of their shared history. But for the first time in many years, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As she sat there with her son, the silence between them no longer felt like a barrier, but a space waiting to be filled with the words they had never spoken. And in that moment, Clara knew something important. It wasn't too late. Clara spent the next few weeks in a state of quiet astonishment. After Daniel's unexpected return, things had changed between them in ways she hadn't anticipated. The silence that had once hung between them like a heavy curtain was slowly lifting, and each conversation, though tentative and often awkward, began to feel like a bridge between two people who had been strangers for far too long. Clara had spent so many years living with the absence of her son that it was difficult to believe he was truly back in her life. But he was, and each day that passed brought a new sense of possibility, a new chance for healing. Still, things were far from perfect. Daniel wasn't the same young man who had left all those years ago. He had grown into someone she didn't fully recognize, a man with a weary look in his eyes, a man who had lived a life full of mistakes and regrets. But he was there trying. That alone was enough to make Clara's heart swell with cautious hope. In the mornings, they would sit together at the kitchen table, sipping coffee in silence before either of them spoke. At night, they would watch old movies on television, or sometimes just talk about what had been lost between them. They were both learning to rebuild, brick by brick, the relationship that had once seemed so solid and unbreakable. It was during one of these quiet mornings, a few weeks after Daniel's return, that Clara found herself wandering into the back room of her house, the room that had once been her art studio. It had been years since she had picked up a paintbrush, and as she stepped into the room, she felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her. The room was exactly as it had been when she had last used it. Canvases stacked against the walls, brushes neatly arranged on the work table, and a faint smell of paint that lingered in the air. For a moment, Clara stood still, taking it all in. She had forgotten how much she loved this space, how much she loved to create. In the hustle and bustle of family life, with all the demands of raising children, maintaining a home, and teaching, her art had slipped to the background. But now, as she stood there alone, she could feel the spark of inspiration reignite inside her. For weeks, Clara had been consumed with the task of rebuilding her relationship with Daniel. But now, in the stillness of the room, she realized that she had neglected something vital. She had neglected herself, her passions, her creativity. The things that had once brought her joy were all buried beneath the weight of responsibilities and the pain of loss. She couldn't remember the last time she had taken the time to do something purely for herself, to reconnect with the person she had once been before life had swept her along. Without much thought, Clara reached for a blank canvas and set it up on the easel. She took a deep breath and picked up a brush, the familiar weight of it in her hand bringing back a flood of memories. It was as though no time had passed at all. The first stroke she made was tentative, but as soon as the paint hit the canvas, Clara felt something shift within her. It was as if the act of creating unlocked a door deep inside her, a door she had long ago closed. She painted for hours that day, lost in the rhythm of the brush strokes and the colors that danced before her eyes. She hadn't felt this alive in years. The act of creating brought her a sense of peace and fulfillment that she had forgotten was possible. When she finally stepped back from the canvas, she was surprised by what she had accomplished. A landscape, soft and muted, but with an undeniable depth and emotion. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was hers. As the days passed, Clara found herself returning to the studio again and again. Painting became a kind of therapy for her, a way to process the emotions that were bubbling to the surface as her relationship with Daniel grew. There was a rawness to her work now, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She poured her heart onto the canvas, each piece reflecting her internal struggle, her joy, her pain, and her hopes for the future. With every brushstroke, she felt a little more whole, a little more like the person she had been before life had become so complicated. Daniel noticed the change in her, though he didn't say much about it at first. He was still trying to navigate the delicate dance of their new relationship, unsure of how to fit into the world she had built without him. He often watched her as she painted, sometimes silently observing from the doorway, other times sitting nearby, offering quiet words of encouragement. Clara wasn't sure how much of her art he truly understood, but the way he looked at her, the way his eyes softened when he saw her immersed in her creative process, told her everything she needed to know. One afternoon, as she was finishing a new painting, Daniel came into the room and stood beside her. She glanced up, a little surprised, but he didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied the canvas, his expression thoughtful. "This one is different," he said quietly. It's like you're telling a story with it. Like it's more than just paint on a canvas." Clara smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I guess I am. It's just something I needed to say, but I couldn't find the words. Painting has always been how I process things." Daniel nodded, his eyes still on the painting. "I can see that. It's beautiful, Mom." His words meant more to her than she could express. There was something incredibly healing in the simplicity of his praise, in the recognition of something she had poured so much of herself into. For the first time in years, Clara felt as though she had a voice again, a way to express everything that had been building inside her. As the weeks went on, Clara's art became a central part of her life once more. But it wasn't just the act of painting that was fulfilling. It was the way it connected her to her past, to the woman she had been before the years of loss and disappointment had dulled her spirit. She had always been an artist, and now, in her 80s, she was rediscovering the passion that had once burned so brightly within her. It was as if, through her art, she was finding herself again. And, slowly, she began to share her work with others. At first, it was just a small local gallery where she showed a few pieces to friends and neighbors. But as word spread about the elderly artist who was painting again after so many years, her work started to gain attention. Clara was invited to participate in community art shows, and her pieces were displayed alongside works by younger, more established artists. She was hesitant at first, unsure of how her art would be received, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. People were drawn to the emotional depth of her paintings, to the vulnerability and honesty that radiated from the canvas. It wasn't about fame or recognition for Clara. She didn't care if she ever sold a painting. What mattered was the connection she was making with others, the way her art allowed her to communicate in ways words never could. She was rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried for so long, and the joy that came with that was more fulfilling than she could have imagined. Her relationship with Daniel also continued to evolve. As they spent more time together, Clara began to realize that their bond was stronger than she had given it credit for. The years of silence had created a chasm between them, but it had also given them both the space to grow and change. Daniel wasn't the same person who had left all those years ago, and neither was Clara. They were both learning to meet each other in a new way, to appreciate each other for the people they had become, not the people they once were. One evening, after a particularly successful art show, Clara and Daniel sat together in the living room, sipping wine and reflecting on the day. Clara was exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the kind of tired that came from living fully, from rediscovering what it meant to be alive. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this at my age," Clara said, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "I thought I was done. I thought I was just waiting for the end." Daniel looked at her, his expression serious but warm. "You're not done, Mom. You're just getting started." Clara smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest at his words. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt as though anything was possible. She had rediscovered her passion for painting, and in doing so, she had rediscovered herself. She had learned that it was never too late to start again, to reclaim the pieces of yourself that had been lost along the way. And as she sat there with her son, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. She had no idea what the next chapter of her life would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she was excited to find out. Clara had always been a social person, at least when she was younger. Before Daniel had left and life had settled into its quiet routine, she had hosted dinner parties, gone to book clubs, and volunteered at local charities. But after years of living in the shadow of Daniel's absence, and later, after George's death, Clara found herself retreating into a solitude she never imagined she would accept. The neighbors would wave as they passed by, and she would chat with Miss Henderson or Mr. Thompson if she ran into them at the grocery store. But beyond that, her social world had become sparse. She had grown used to the silence of her home and the peace it offered, even if it sometimes felt like an isolation that was difficult to break free from. However, with Daniel's return and the changes that were unfolding in her life, Clara began to realize something she hadn't fully acknowledged before. She was ready to reconnect with the world. It was as if a part of her that had been dormant for so many years was slowly waking up, urging her to embrace the connections she had once taken for granted. At first, the idea of putting herself out there again felt daunting. She had always been a bit reserved about making new friends, unsure of where to start or what the purpose would be. But as she watched the community around her, young mothers walking their children to the park, elderly couples tending to their gardens, and even the occasional stranger stopping by the bakery for coffee, she realized that there was a life waiting for her to re-enter it, a life she had neglected for too long. One afternoon, as Clara was leaving the local grocery store, she noticed a small flyer taped to the community bulletin board. It was an advertisement for a new seniors book club that was meeting at the local community center every Thursday afternoon. Clara stood there for a moment, reading over the details. The idea of joining a book club had always appealed to her. She had read countless novels over the years, devouring stories as a way to escape and learn about the world beyond her own. And though her days were often filled with routine, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the push she needed to start something new, to open up to people in a way she hadn't in years. It was a small step, but it felt like the right one. The following Thursday, Clara walked to the community center with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. She had always been a good reader, but the idea of sharing her thoughts with a group of strangers made her feel self-conscious. Would they be interested in hearing what she had to say? Would they judge her for being out of touch with modern literature? These thoughts swirled in her mind as she walked down the familiar path toward the building. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing. She was tired of being alone. When Clara entered the community center, she was greeted by the sight of a small group of people gathered around a table, chatting casually. They looked like the kind of people Clara had once known, people who laughed easily, shared stories, and spoke with warmth. A woman with silver hair, wearing glasses, noticed Clara's hesitation and smiled. "Hello there. You must be Clara. We've been expecting you. I'm Evelyn, and this is the rest of the group," she said warmly, gesturing to the others. There was a man named George, a retired engineer who had recently become a widower, a young woman named Natalie, who worked as a nurse, and a few others. The group was small, but Clara could sense immediately that it was a welcoming space. After some brief introductions, they settled into the discussion. The book they were reading that month was a classic, Pride and Prejudice, and Clara felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had read it many times before and could easily follow the conversation. As they discussed the themes of love, class, and social expectation, Clara found herself speaking up. She didn't hesitate, as she might have in the past. There was something about this group, something about their openness and shared love of books, that made her feel like her voice mattered again. As the meeting went on, Clara realized how much she had missed these kinds of discussions, the exchange of ideas, the exploration of different perspectives, and the way a book could bring people together. The conversations flowed easily, and Clara found herself laughing at the anecdotes shared by George, the retired engineer, who had a knack for making everyone laugh with his dry sense of humor. Evelyn, the organizer, was warm and attentive, always encouraging everyone to share their thoughts. Natalie, the nurse, had a deep appreciation for the emotional depth of characters and often related the stories to her own experiences with patients. Clara had not expected to feel so connected to a group of strangers, but here she was part of something bigger, something that filled a void she hadn't known was there. The book club meetings continued every Thursday afternoon, and Clara made it a point to attend religiously. Each meeting brought new connections, new insights, and new friendships. As the weeks passed, Clara's world began to expand in ways she hadn't anticipated. She started having coffee with Evelyn after the meetings, talking about everything from literature to life. Evelyn had recently lost her husband, and she shared with Clara how difficult it had been to find her way after his death. In Evelyn, Clara found a kindred spirit, a woman who understood the quiet ache of loss, but also the importance of continuing to live with intention and purpose. Their conversations became a lifeline for Clara, a reminder that she wasn't alone in her experiences. George, the retired engineer, turned out to be a fascinating man. Though he was often quiet during the book discussions, he had a wealth of stories from his long career and life adventures. He had traveled extensively and had a deep knowledge of history and architecture. Clara enjoyed spending time with him, especially when they would sit on a bench in the community garden after the meetings, sipping tea and watching the world go by. George had a calm, steady presence that brought Clara peace, and they developed a quiet camaraderie that she hadn't expected. But it wasn't just the older members of the group who had an impact on Clara. Natalie, the young nurse, had a bright energy about her that made everyone feel at ease. She was full of life and passion, constantly encouraging others to open up and share their stories. She was the first to suggest that they take the book club discussions outdoors in the summer, meeting in the local park under the shade of the trees. The idea of being surrounded by nature while discussing books brought an entirely new dynamic to the group. Clara found herself looking forward to those sunny afternoons in the park, where they would share laughter and thoughts, as the pages of their books were turned beneath the warm sun. With each passing week, Clara became more involved, more present in her life and in the lives of those around her. The book club became a foundation, a place where she could reconnect with herself and others in a way she hadn't allowed for many years. The simple act of reading and discussing books brought a sense of community, a sense of belonging that Clara had missed. She realized that, even at 80, it was possible to make new friends, to find new passions, and to create new memories. Her life, which had once felt like a quiet, isolated existence, was now filled with meaningful connections. As time went on, Clara started inviting other people into her world as well. She invited Daniel to attend the book club meeting with her one afternoon, unsure of how he would react. But to her surprise, he was enthusiastic about the idea. He had never been much of a reader when he was younger, but after years of working long hours and focusing on his career, he found that he missed the simple pleasures of reading. Clara introduced him to the group, and they welcomed him with open arms. Though Daniel was shy at first, he soon found himself enjoying the discussions, especially when George would share his stories about engineering and history. The book club became another way for Clara and Daniel to connect, another bridge between the past and the future. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt like she was truly living, not just existing. The book club was more than just a group of people coming together to talk about literature. It was a space where she could rediscover who she was, who she had been, and who she was becoming. And as the months went by, she realized that the relationships she was building, relationships with people of all ages and backgrounds, were the very things that made life worth living at 80. There was so much to explore, so much to learn, and so much to share. Clara's life was no longer defined by loss or by the weight of time. It was defined by the friendships she was making and the connections she was nurturing. In the quiet moments when Clara sat back and reflected on how far she had come, she realized something profound. It wasn't just the art, the painting, or the solitude that had given her life new meaning. It was the people, the friendships, the shared moments of laughter, wisdom, and kindness. These were the things that made life worth living at 80, and they were the things Clara would cherish for the rest of her days. Clara woke up early, the golden light of dawn spilling through her window as the birds sang their first songs of the day. It was a quiet morning, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself a moment to simply appreciate the stillness around her. Life had changed so much in the past few months, and yet, in this moment, it felt peaceful. Daniel had been staying with her for nearly 6 months now, and their relationship had grown deeper than Clara had dared hope. The years of silence between them had been bridged by honest conversations, shared moments, and the slow, steady process of rebuilding trust. It wasn't perfect. There were still unresolved tensions and unspoken hurts, but it was enough. Clara had learned to be content with the progress they had made, even if it was slow. She had also found herself deeply immersed in her art once more. Her paintings were no longer just an escape or a hobby. They were a way to communicate emotions and stories that words alone could not convey. Her studio, once a forgotten space filled with dust, was now a sanctuary. Each brushstroke felt like a small act of defiance against the years of silence and grief that had dominated her life. The work wasn't always easy. Sometimes she found herself stuck, unable to express what was in her heart. But when the colors came together, when the image began to take shape, it felt like a release, a healing. For the past few weeks, Clara had been working on a large piece, one that she had been avoiding for months. It was a portrait of George, her late husband. He had been gone for over a decade now, and Clara had painted him many times in her life. But this piece was different. This time, she wasn't just painting his likeness. She was trying to capture the essence of the love they had shared, the complexity of their marriage, and the way he had shaped her life. It wasn't an easy painting to work on. The process often left her emotionally drained, and yet it felt necessary. As if completing this portrait would help her finally let go of the pain, the loss, and the lingering regrets. Daniel had noticed the intensity of her focus when she worked on the painting. He had always known how much art meant to her, but he hadn't understood the depth of her emotions until he saw the way she poured herself into her work. It wasn't just about the art. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself that she had lost along the way. And Daniel, despite his own struggles, understood the need for that. He had his own way of coping, his own journey of rediscovery. For Clara, that journey was through the pain on the canvas. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Clara glanced at Daniel. He had been quieter than usual, and she could tell that something was weighing on him. She had learned to read him well over the months, and she knew that he was grappling with something more profound than the everyday worries of life. They had talked about his past, about the mistakes he had made, about the time lost between them. But there was still so much unsaid, so much still left unexamined. "Daniel, what's going on? You've been so distant lately," Clara asked gently, her voice full of concern. Daniel hesitated for a moment, looking at his hands as if the words were trapped somewhere deep inside him. He had always struggled with expressing his emotions, with putting into words the things he had buried for so long. "I'm just tired, Mom," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "I feel like I've wasted so much time. I'm not where I thought I'd be at this point in my life. I made so many mistakes, and I don't know how to make things right." His words hung in the air, and Clara could feel the weight of them. It was a confession, a vulnerable admission that he had been holding inside for too long. Clara's heart ached for him, for the pain he was carrying. She reached across the table and took his hand in hers. "We all make mistakes, Daniel. We all have regrets. But that doesn't mean it's too late to start over. I know it might not seem like it, but I believe in you. You don't have to fix everything all at once. You just have to keep trying. And you're not alone in this." Daniel looked at her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the truth in her words. For a long moment, there was silence between them, a quiet understanding that words couldn't quite capture. And then, for the first time in a long while, Daniel smiled. A small, unsure smile, but a smile nonetheless. It was a smile that held both gratitude and sorrow, hope and doubt. But it was a start. The days that followed were a mix of small victories and setbacks, of conversations that felt awkward but necessary. Clara continued to work on her painting, finding solace in the process, while Daniel began to take tentative steps toward confronting his past. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments of frustration, moments when Daniel would retreat into himself, moments when Clara would question whether anything would ever truly change. But they both persevered, learning to trust in the process, learning to trust each other. One evening, several weeks later, Clara completed the portrait of George. It wasn't perfect, but it was raw, real, and full of emotion. As she stepped back and looked at the painting, she felt a sense of closure wash over her. It was time to let go of the pain, to let go of the grief that had defined so much of her life. The painting wasn't a way to erase the past. It was a way to honor it, to accept it, and to move forward. That night, after dinner, Clara invited Daniel into the studio to see the finished piece. He stood in front of it for a long moment, studying the portrait with a quiet intensity. Clara watched him, unsure of what he would think. She had painted George in a way that was more about feeling than likeness. There was no idealized version of him here, no attempt to make him seem perfect. It was a portrait of a man she had loved deeply, with all his flaws and strengths, his gentleness and his stubbornness. "You did it, Mom," Daniel said finally, his voice thick with emotion. It's really him. I can see him in the way you've painted him, in the way you've captured his spirit." Clara smiled softly, her heart full. "I wanted to remember him, Daniel. Not just the man he was, but the way he made me feel. The love we shared." For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They stood together in front of the painting, silently acknowledging the past and the future that lay ahead of them. As the days turned into months, Clara's life continued to evolve. Her bond with Daniel grew stronger, more grounded in understanding and acceptance. They still had their moments of difficulty, but they were no longer defined by the silence that had once separated them. Clara's art became more than just a form of expression. It became a way to connect, to share the parts of herself that words could never fully capture. And Daniel, slowly but surely, began to rebuild his life, learning to let go of the weight of regret and embrace the possibility of change. Clara also continued her involvement with the book club. She had formed deep, lasting friendships with the members, and those relationships became a vital part of her life. The book club meetings were no longer just an activity. They were a place of refuge, of conversation, of shared experiences. They had become a reminder that no matter how old you were, no matter how many years had passed, it was never too late to make new connections, to learn, and to grow. And so, life moved forward. Clara had come to understand that life at 80 wasn't about waiting for something to happen. It was about embracing the present, about finding joy in the little moments, about taking risks and opening up to new experiences. It was about accepting the past, honoring it, and using it as a foundation for building a future that was full of possibility. She had rediscovered herself through her art, through her relationship with Daniel, and through the friendships she had nurtured. And though she couldn't predict what the future held, Clara had learned to face it with hope, with courage, and with the deep understanding that life, no matter how long or short, was worth living. As Clara sat in her studio one evening, her eyes drifting over her canvases and her latest work, she realized something profound. She had lived, truly lived, not just existed. She had embraced love, loss, and all the complexities that came with them. She had learned that it wasn't the years that define a life, but the moments that made it meaningful. And in that moment, as she looked at the portrait of George hanging on the wall, Clara knew that she was ready to face whatever came next.